December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor gets sucker punched. America wakes up pissed off, and suddenly everyone's in a hurry to build ships that can actually win a war instead of just looking good in peacetime parades. Enter the USS Indianapolis, a heavy cruiser that spent the next 4 years proving she was one of the finest warships in the Pacific Fleet. She fought in frozen hell and tropical paradise, served as flagship for some of the most important victories in naval history, and completed what was arguably the most crucial cargo run in human history. Then she got torpedoed while nobody was looking. This is the story of a ship that did everything her country asked of her, and how her country thanked her for it. It's about duty, sacrifice, and the kind of institutional incompetence that would make a DMV employee blush. Most of all, it's about 1,196 sailors who found themselves floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with nothing but life jackets and the growing realization that their own Navy had forgotten they existed. Spoiler alert, it doesn't end well. Chapter 1. Built for Glory. Let's start at the beginning, back when America still thought treaties could keep everyone from killing each other. It's 1930, the Great Depression is kicking everyone's teeth in, and the world's navies are playing a gentleman's game called let's all agree to build smaller warships so we don't accidentally start World War III. Spoiler alert, that didn't work out so great. On March 31, 1930, some guy with a hard hat ceremoniously laid the keel of what would become the USS Indianapolis at the New York Shipbuilding Corporation. Now, if you're not a ship nerd, laying a keel is basically when they start putting together the backbone of the ship. Think of it as the moment when your house stops being a hole in the ground and becomes an actual foundation. The Indianapolis was going to be a Portland-class heavy cruiser, which in 1930s naval parlance meant we're going to strap the biggest guns we can legally get away with onto a hull that can still theoretically be called a cruiser. The Washington and London naval treaties basically turned shipbuilding into the world's most expensive rules lawyering contest. It's like building a race car for a speed limit. You're not trying to go slow. You're trying to go as fast as possible while the cop can't technically give you a ticket. The Indianapolis was going to weigh in at nearly 10,000 tons empty, or almost 13,000 tons when stuffed with enough ammunition to level a small city. She'd be 610 feet long, longer than 2 football fields, and 66 feet wide. 4 Parsons turbines would push her through the water at over 32 knots, which is fast enough to outrun most of the things that could kill her, and her 9 8-inch guns would handle the things she couldn't outrun. On paper, she looked pretty good. In reality, well, let's just say the designers made some interesting choices. See, when you're building a treaty cruiser, you're basically playing a game of engineering Jenga. You want maximum firepower, decent armor, and high speed, but you can only pick 2.5 of those things because physics is a real pain in the ass. The Indianapolis got the firepower and speed. The armor, let's call it optimistic. Her belt armor maxed out at 5 inches, which sounds impressive until you realize that enemy 8-inch shells could punch through that like it was made of cardboard. But hey, what she lacked in protection, she made up for in the ability to run away really, really fast. November 7, 1931 was launch day, the moment when the Indianapolis got to meet water for the first time. Picture thousands of people gathered around the shipyard, brass bands playing, politicians giving speeches that nobody remembers, and some dignitary's wife cracking a champagne bottle against the bow while hoping she doesn't completely whiff it in front of all those cameras. The ship slid down the ways and hit the water with all the grace of a 10,000-ton steel whale, and suddenly the Indianapolis was no longer just a really expensive pile of metal. She was a ship, but she wasn't ready to fight yet. That took another year of installing everything from the massive gun turrets to the coffee makers. On November 15, 1932, Captain John M. Smiali stepped aboard and officially commissioned the USS Indianapolis into the United States Navy. She was now a real warship, with a real crew and real responsibilities. The Indianapolis spent her first few years doing shakedown cruises and Atlantic patrols, basically learning how to be a warship without anyone shooting at her. This is when they figured out that she rolled like a drunk sailor in heavy seas. Apparently, those naval architects had been a little too focused on making her fast and forgot to make her comfortable. So they added bilge keels and superchargers, which is ship speak for we bolted some stuff to the bottom to make her stop rolling around like a washing machine with a broken suspension. It helped, sort of. But here's where the Indianapolis really started to make a name for herself: presidential taxi service. In 1933 and again in 1936, she had the honor of hauling Franklin Delano Roosevelt around on various diplomatic missions. Now, you might think this sounds pretty cushy. After all, how hard can it be to give the president a boat ride? Except FDR's idea of a relaxing cruise involved sailing through some of the most politically volatile waters on the planet, while half of Europe was busy rearming for the sequel to the Great War. Still, the Indianapolis handled her VIP duties with all the professionalism you'd expect from a ship named after a city in Indiana. By the late 1930s, the crew of the Indianapolis could take genuine pride in their ship. She was fast, she was powerful, and she had that indefinable something that separates a good ship from a great one. As the world started sliding toward another global unpleasantness, the Indianapolis and her crew were ready for whatever came next, or so they thought. Chapter 2. Baptism of Fire. December 7, 1941 started out as a perfectly ordinary Sunday morning for the crew of the USS Indianapolis. They were anchored at Johnston Atoll, which, if you've never heard of it, is basically a tiny speck of coral and bird crap in the middle of the Pacific that exists solely to give the Navy a place to put fuel tanks and complain about the heat. The Indianapolis was there for what the Navy calls routine operations, which is military speak for we're not really sure why we sent you there, but you're there now, so try to look busy. The crew was probably looking forward to a lazy Sunday, maybe some letter writing, a little maintenance, the usual peacetime routine. Then the radio started crackling with something that would change everything. Air Raid Pearl Harbor X. This is no drill. Now, imagine you're a sailor on a ship named after a city in Indiana, anchored at an atoll most people couldn't find on a map with a flashlight and a magnifying glass, and you suddenly realize that your country has just been sucker punched into a world war. The Indianapolis went from peacetime cruiser to frontline warship in the span of a single radio transmission. The lucky thing? They weren't at Pearl Harbor. The unlucky thing? Pretty much everything else. See, the Indianapolis had been scheduled to be at Pearl on December 7th. If they'd stuck to the original plan, she'd have been sitting in the harbor like a big steel target when Yamamoto's boys came calling. Instead, a last-minute change in orders had sent her to Johnston Atoll, which meant she missed out on what military historians politely call a very bad morning. But missing Pearl Harbor didn't mean missing the war. Oh no. The war was about to find the Indianapolis in a big way. The immediate aftermath of Pearl was about as organized as a chicken coop in a tornado. The Pacific Fleet had just been gut-punched, half the battleships were sitting on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, and suddenly everyone was realizing that maybe, just maybe, the Japanese weren't going to be the pushover they'd expected. The Indianapolis, along with every other ship that could still float and fight, got new orders: find the Japanese fleet and make them regret their life choices. This sounds simple until you realize that the Pacific Ocean is really, really big, and the Japanese had a disturbing tendency to show up where they weren't supposed to be and disappear when you actually wanted to fight them. Early 1942 was a crash course in the difference between peacetime exercises and actual combat. During peacetime, the enemy shoots blanks and follows a script. During wartime, the enemy shoots back with real bullets and has the annoying habit of not following your battle plan. The Indianapolis spent February through June 1942 in the South Pacific, doing what cruisers do best: escorting aircraft carriers and trying not to get sunk. This might sound like a simple job, but carrier escort duty in 1942 was like being a bodyguard for someone that every bully in the neighborhood wants to beat up. Aircraft carriers were the new queens of the Pacific, but they were also floating ammunition dumps with runways on top. One lucky hit from an enemy bomber or submarine, and your multi-million-dollar floating airfield turns into the world's most expensive fireworks display. The Indianapolis's job was to make sure that didn't happen. The Coral Sea region became the Indianapolis's classroom for Combat 101. This was where the crew learned the difference between theory and practice, between peacetime gunnery and actually trying to shoot down planes that were actively trying to kill you. Picture this: you're standing on the deck of a cruiser, the ship is moving at flank speed and turning hard to avoid incoming bombs, the anti-aircraft guns are making noise like the world's angriest industrial accident, and you're supposed to track and shoot down planes that are moving at 200 miles per hour while your platform is bouncing around like a mechanical bull. Oh, and if you miss, everyone dies. The Indianapolis's gunners got very good, very fast. They had to. The alternative was becoming fish food, which has a way of concentrating the mind. During these early months, the ship also discovered that all those peacetime modifications had been, let's call them learning experiences. The superchargers that were supposed to help with rolling actually made things worse in some conditions. The additional equipment that had been added over the years made her top-heavy, which meant she had a tendency to lean into turns like a motorcycle, except motorcycles don't have 1,200 people aboard who really prefer to stay upright. But the crew adapted, because that's what good crews do. They learned to work with their ship's quirks, to anticipate her behavior in heavy seas and high-speed turns. They learned to love her despite her flaws, or maybe because of them. By mid-1942, the Indianapolis was no longer a peacetime cruiser with a peacetime crew. She was a combat veteran, baptized in the fires of the early Pacific War. Her crew had learned to sleep through the sound of general quarters, to eat standing up during battle stations, to write letters home knowing they might be the last ones their families ever received. The experience gained in the crucible of the South Pacific would prove invaluable as the Indianapolis faced her next challenge, one that would test both ship and crew in ways they never imagined. Chapter 3: Proving Ground in the North. So, you know how everyone talks about World War II in the Pacific and immediately thinks of tropical islands, palm trees, and beaches? Well, somebody forgot to tell that to the guys who got sent to the Aleutians, where the biggest enemy wasn't the Japanese, it was hypothermia. Welcome to the ass end of Alaska, where the weather is terrible, the terrain is worse, and the enemy has the good sense to be just as miserable as you are. In August 1942, while other ships were heading to sunny tropical paradises to get shot at, the Indianapolis got orders for the Aleutian Islands campaign. If you're not familiar with the Aleutians, picture a chain of volcanic rocks sticking out of the North Pacific like God's own broken teeth, covered in fog, lashed by winds that could strip paint, and inhabited mainly by birds that have given up on life. The Japanese had managed to occupy a couple of these delightful vacation spots, Attu and Kiska, in June 1942, which made them the only foreign power to occupy American soil since the War of 1812. This was, as you might imagine, considered somewhat embarrassing by the folks in Washington. Now, you might wonder why anyone would want to fight over what amounts to a collection of frozen, fog-shrouded rocks where the only entertainment is watching seabirds commit suicide against the cliffs. The answer is simple: because they were American frozen, fog-shrouded rocks, damn it. Also, there was the small matter of Japan potentially using them as stepping stones to attack the West Coast, but mostly it was the principle of the thing. The Indianapolis's first taste of Aleutian warfare came in July 1942 with the bombardment of Kiska. Now, bombardment sounds very dramatic and warlike, but the reality of naval gunfire in the Aleutians was like trying to hit a target while wearing a blindfold, standing on a trampoline, in a snowstorm. The weather up there didn't just suck, it sucked with a dedication and thoroughness that bordered on artistic. Visibility was usually measured in tens of feet rather than miles. The wind didn't blow so much as it attacked everything that had the audacity to exist above sea level. And the seas? Let's just say that anyone who thought the Indianapolis rolled badly in normal conditions was about to get a real education in nautical misery. Picture this: you're trying to bombard Japanese positions that you can't see, on an island you can barely find, while your ship is being tossed around by waves the size of apartment buildings and winds that sound like the world's angriest freight train. Your 8-inch guns are supposed to be precision instruments of naval warfare, but precision becomes somewhat academic when you're not sure which way is up. The Indianapolis and her crew quickly learned that Aleutian combat was less about textbook naval tactics and more about endurance. This wasn't the quick, brutal exchanges of the South Pacific. This was a grinding, miserable war of attrition where frostbite was as likely to kill you as enemy fire. The crew had to adapt to conditions that would have made a polar bear complain. Everything metal was either frozen or wet, usually both. Equipment that worked perfectly in normal conditions had a tendency to fail spectacularly when exposed to the Aleutian climate. Simple tasks like loading shells or maintaining guns became exercises in pain tolerance and creative profanity. But here's the thing about sailors: they adapt. The crew of the Indianapolis figured out how to fight in conditions that would have sent lesser mortals running back to their mothers. They learned to work in weather gear that made them look like pregnant penguins, to navigate by instinct when visibility dropped to zero, to sleep in bunks that alternated between freezing cold and soaking wet. February 1943 brought the engagement at Attu, which was like Kiska but with more Japanese shooting back. The Indianapolis, along with other Allied ships, provided naval gunfire support for what turned out to be one of the most brutal and unnecessary campaigns of the Pacific War. Attu was where the Indianapolis crew got their first real taste of close-range combat. Unlike the long-distance carrier battles of the South Pacific, Aleutian fighting often came down to ships dueling with shore batteries at ranges where you could practically see the whites of the enemy gunner's eyes, assuming you could see anything through the fog and snow. The Indianapolis's guns spoke with authority during these engagements, hurling 8-inch shells at Japanese positions with a precision that was frankly miraculous given the conditions. Her crew had learned to compensate for the rolling and pitching, to time their shots to the rhythm of the seas, to fight their ship with a skill that impressed even the grizzled veterans of earlier campaigns. By the time the Aleutian campaign wound down in August 1943, the Indianapolis had earned something more valuable than medals or commendations. She had earned the respect of her crew and her sister ships. She had proven that she could fight in any conditions against any enemy, in any corner of the Pacific. The harsh proving ground of the North Pacific had transformed both ship and crew. They were no longer the peacetime sailors who had been caught by surprise at Pearl Harbor. They were combat veterans, tempered by some of the worst fighting conditions of the war. As the Indianapolis headed south toward warmer waters and new battles, her crew knew they had survived the Aleutians. They had no way of knowing that their real test was still ahead of them. Chapter 4: Flagship of Victory. November 1943 was when the USS Indianapolis hit the big time. After spending months getting frozen, soaked, and generally abused in the Aleutians, she got orders that would make any warship jealous: report to Admiral Raymond Spruance and become the flagship of the Fifth Fleet. Now, if you don't know who Raymond Spruance was, imagine the most competent, unflappable, quietly brilliant naval commander you can think of, then multiply that by about 10. Spruance was the guy who won the Battle of Midway, which was basically where America told Japan, "Thanks for playing, but we'll be taking over from here." Being chosen as Spruance's flagship wasn't just an honor, it was like being picked for the varsity team of naval warfare. The Indianapolis was about to become the command center for some of the most important operations in the Pacific War. But first, she needed some modifications. You can't just take a regular cruiser and expect her to handle the communications, staff, and general chaos that comes with being a fleet flagship. The Indianapolis got a major refit that added enough radio equipment to contact Mars, additional staff quarters for all the extra officers, and enough charts and plotting tables to navigate the entire Pacific Ocean. Unfortunately, all this extra gear made her even more top-heavy than before, which meant she now rolled like a drunken elephant on roller skates. But hey, at least she could roll while coordinating the movements of hundreds of ships across thousands of miles of ocean. The Indianapolis's first major test as flagship came with the Gilbert Islands campaign in November 1943. This was America's first real offensive push into the Central Pacific, and it was about as subtle as a sledgehammer to the face. The target was Tarawa, a coral atoll that the Japanese had turned into what they optimistically called an unsinkable aircraft carrier. The Americans had a different name for it: target practice. The Indianapolis, with Admiral Spruance aboard, coordinated one of the most massive naval bombardments in history. Hundreds of ships converged on the tiny atoll, ready to pound it into submission with more explosive power than had been used in some entire wars. From her position as flagship, the Indianapolis didn't just participate in the bombardment, she orchestrated it. Her communications center became the nerve center for the entire operation, coordinating everything from battleship gun salvos to aircraft strikes. The Indianapolis's own 8-inch guns joined the symphony of destruction, hurling shells at Japanese positions with a precision that was the product of 2 years of hard-won combat experience. Her crew had learned their trade in the frozen hell of the Aleutians, and now they were applying those lessons in the tropical hell of the Central Pacific. The Gilbert Islands campaign was followed by the Marshalls in early 1944, where the Indianapolis continued her role as the fleet's brain center. Kwajalein Atoll became the next target, and the Indianapolis was there to make sure it got the full American treatment, overwhelming firepower applied with surgical precision. But it was during the Marianas campaign that the Indianapolis really hit her stride. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam weren't just strategic objectives, they were stepping stones to Japan itself. Taking them would put American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands, which would basically end the war. The Indianapolis spent weeks providing fire support for the amphibious landings, her guns speaking with the authority of a ship that had learned her trade the hard way. Day after day, her crew loaded and fired, turning Japanese strongpoints into smoking craters with the methodical precision of a deadly assembly line. Then came June 19, 1944, a date that would go down in naval aviation history as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese, in what can only be described as a moment of spectacular optimism, decided to launch a massive carrier-based air attack against the American fleet. They sent wave after wave of aircraft, confident that their superior pilot training and fighting spirit would carry the day. They were wrong. Very, very wrong. The Indianapolis, along with every other ship in the fleet, opened up with everything they had. The sky filled with anti-aircraft fire so thick you could practically walk on it. American fighters tore through the Japanese formations like wolves through a flock of sheep. From her position as flagship, the Indianapolis had a front-row seat to one of the most one-sided aerial battles in history. Her own gunners claimed several Japanese aircraft, adding to a tally that would see over 400 enemy planes shot down in a single day. Watching from the Indianapolis's bridge, Admiral Spruance witnessed the effective end of Japanese naval aviation. The enemy had thrown everything they had at the American fleet and had been swatted aside like gnats. The Indianapolis continued her role as flagship through the rest of 1944, coordinating operations that slowly but inexorably tightened the noose around Japan. The Palau campaign, the strikes on the Philippines, the systematic destruction of Japanese air and naval power, all of it was planned and coordinated from the Indianapolis's cramped but efficient command spaces. By early 1945, the Indianapolis had become more than just a ship. She was the nerve center of American victory in the Pacific. Her crew understood they were part of something historic, serving aboard the flagship during some of the most important victories in naval history. The war was winding down, victory was in sight, and the Indianapolis had played a crucial role in making it happen. As 1945 dawned, Her crew looked forward to finishing the job they'd started at Pearl Harbor. They had no way of knowing that their greatest triumph and most tragic failure were still ahead of them. Chapter 5. The Final Campaigns. By 1945, the USS Indianapolis had become what you might call a problem solver in the Pacific Fleet. Got a heavily fortified island that needs some attitude adjustment? Call the Indianapolis. Need someone to coordinate a massive amphibious assault while simultaneously providing fire support and serving tea to admirals? The Indianapolis was your girl. But as the war entered its final phase, the problems were getting bigger, the stakes were getting higher, and the Japanese were getting more creative in their attempts to kill Americans. This led to some truly spectacular displays of what military historians politely call aggressive defensive tactics and everyone else calls holy shit, they're trying to crash planes into our ships on purpose. The Indianapolis started 1945 with something that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier: strikes against Tokyo itself. The ship that had spent 1942 learning not to get sunk was now part of a fleet that had the audacity to sail up to Japan's front door and knock with high explosives. The carrier strikes on Tokyo in February 1945 were like a preview of coming attractions, a way of telling the Japanese that American bombers would soon be making regular house calls. The Indianapolis provided escort and coordination for these operations, her radar screens tracking American aircraft as they flew off to introduce Japanese civilians to the concept of strategic bombing. From her position as flagship, the Indianapolis had a front-row seat to the systematic dismantling of Japanese air power. Enemy fighters that rose to challenge the American strikes were met by what can only be described as overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. It was like watching a heavyweight boxer fight a bunch of middle schoolers, technically a contest, but the outcome was never in doubt. Then came Iwo Jima, which was basically 8 square miles of volcanic ash that the Japanese had turned into the most fortified piece of real estate on Earth. The Indianapolis arrived in February 1945, took one look at the island, and essentially said, well, this is going to suck. Iwo Jima was where the Indianapolis learned that some enemies don't know when they're beaten. The Japanese defenders had turned the entire island into a fortress, with tunnels, bunkers, and gun positions that could survive anything short of a direct nuclear strike. The Indianapolis and her sister ships pounded the island for days, turning the surface into a moonscape of craters and rubble. But when the Marines went ashore, they discovered that all that bombardment had basically rearranged the furniture. The Japanese were still there, still fighting, and still very much interested in killing Americans. The Indianapolis spent weeks providing fire support for the Marines, her 8-inch guns speaking with the voice of authority whenever some Japanese strongpoint needed an attitude adjustment. Her crew watched through binoculars as Marines died on beaches that were supposed to have been cleared by naval gunfire, learning the hard lesson that sometimes overwhelming firepower isn't quite overwhelming enough. Okinawa was supposed to be the final rehearsal before the invasion of Japan itself. The Indianapolis arrived in March 1945, expecting another brutal but ultimately successful amphibious campaign. What she got was a preview of what invading Japan would actually look like, and it wasn't pretty. The Japanese had learned from their earlier defeats. Instead of meeting the Americans at the beaches, they let them come ashore, then proceeded to turn the entire island into a meat grinder. Every hill, every village, every cave became a fortress. The Indianapolis found herself providing fire support for battles that seemed to go on forever, her guns wearing out from constant use. But Okinawa also introduced the Indianapolis to a new kind of enemy, the kamikaze. Japanese pilots who had given up on the old-fashioned approach of trying to survive combat and had instead embraced the philosophy of if I'm going to die anyway, I might as well take some Americans with me. On March 31, 1945, the Indianapolis discovered just how effective this tactic could be. The attack came at dawn, because apparently Japanese suicide pilots were early risers. A lone kamikaze, probably piloted by some kid who should have been in college instead of trying to crash a plane into a warship, managed to evade the fleet's combat air patrol and the increasingly frantic anti-aircraft fire. The Indianapolis's gunners threw everything they had at the incoming aircraft: 5-inch shells, 40mm rounds, .50 caliber bullets, probably some harsh language, but the kamikaze kept coming. At the last second, the pilot pulled up slightly, and instead of hitting the ship directly, he clipped the stern. The explosion killed 9 sailors and wounded 29 others. More importantly, it damaged the ship's propellers and stern, leaving her limping and in need of major repairs. The Indianapolis, after 3.5 years of combat, had finally taken a hit that would send her home. As the Indianapolis limped toward Mare Island Navy Yard for repairs, her crew had mixed feelings. They were alive, they were going home, and they had survived one of the most dangerous campaigns of the Pacific War. But they were also leaving their fleet family behind, missing what everyone knew would be the final push against Japan itself. The repairs at Mare Island took 2 months, during which time the crew got to experience the strange luxury of sleeping in beds that didn't move and eating food that hadn't been stored in a metal can for 6 months. It was nice, but it wasn't home. Home was the ship, and the ship was being put back together by shipyard workers who had never heard a shot fired in anger. By July 1945, the Indianapolis was ready to return to war. Her crew was rested, her guns were repaired, and her hull was stronger than ever. As she prepared to leave San Francisco, her crew looked forward to rejoining the fight. After all, what could possibly go wrong with a routine voyage to the Philippines? Chapter 6: The Secret That Would End the War. July 16, 1945, was supposed to be just another day at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco. The USS Indianapolis was taking on supplies for what everyone assumed would be another routine deployment to the Pacific. Routine supplies, routine orders, routine everything. Except for the wooden crate, and the two guys in civilian clothes who look like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Now, wooden crates aren't exactly unusual on Navy ships. The military has been shipping stuff in wooden crates since somebody figured out that putting things in boxes keeps them from falling into the ocean. But this particular crate was different. For starters, it weighed about as much as a small car, which seemed excessive for whatever was rattling around inside. More importantly, it came with its own babysitters. Major Robert Furman and Dr. James Nolan didn't look like your typical military passengers. Furman was an Army intelligence officer who had the sort of nervous energy that suggested he knew secrets that could get him killed. Dr. Nolan was a radiologist who looked like he'd rather be treating patients than riding around on warships carrying mysterious cargo. Neither of them was particularly chatty about what was in the crate. The Indianapolis's crew, being sailors, immediately began speculating about what could possibly be important enough to warrant this level of secrecy and paranoia. The theories ranged from new superweapon to Roosevelt's gold toilet seat. They were closer with the first guess than they knew. What they were actually carrying was about 50 pounds of uranium-235, the fissile core of a weapon that would be called Little Boy. Along with it were various other components for the atomic bomb, detonators, timers, and other bits and pieces that would, in a few weeks, turn a Japanese city into a brief, very bright star. Of course, nobody told the crew this. As far as they knew, they were carrying something important and secret to the Pacific, which described about half of everything the Navy shipped during the war. The only clue was the extraordinary urgency of their orders. Get this cargo to Tinian Island as fast as humanly possible. And when the Navy says as fast as humanly possible, they don't mean when you get around to it. Captain McVay, who'd been driving warships since some of his sailors were in diapers, got orders that were refreshingly simple. Proceed to Tinian at maximum speed, don't stop for anything, and don't ask questions. The Indianapolis cast off from San Francisco on July 16, 1945, carrying the future in a wooden crate chained to the deck of the flag quarters. The uranium projectile, the business end of Little Boy, was literally chained to the floor of Captain McVay's cabin, because apparently the Navy thought the best way to secure the most dangerous substance on Earth was with some chains and a prayer. What followed was one of the most impressive displays of seamanship and marine engineering in naval history. The Indianapolis hauled ass across the Pacific like the devil himself was chasing her. She averaged better than 29 knots for the entire voyage, which doesn't sound impressive until you realize that this was a 13-year-old heavy cruiser loaded down with fuel, supplies, and the secret to ending the war. The run to Pearl Harbor took 74.5 hours, shattering every previous record for the route. The Indianapolis covered 2,405 nautical miles in just over 3 days, proving that when properly motivated, even a treaty cruiser could move like a destroyer. During the voyage, Major Furman and Dr. Nolan maintained their policy of polite but absolute secrecy about their cargo. The crew, being good sailors, respected their privacy while continuing to speculate wildly about what they were carrying. Some of the guesses were actually pretty close to the truth, but nobody was talking. The Indianapolis made a brief stop at Pearl Harbor to refuel and stretch her legs, then continued on to Tinian, arriving on July 26, 1945. The cargo transfer was handled with the sort of careful precision usually reserved for handling live explosives, which was basically what they were doing. The uranium projectile and its associated components were carefully unloaded and handed over to the Manhattan Project team on Tinian. Major Furman and Dr. Nolan, clearly relieved to have their cargo safely delivered, bid farewell to the Indianapolis and her crew. Mission accomplished. The Indianapolis had successfully delivered the components that would become the atomic bomb that ended World War II. It was, by any measure, one of the most important and successful missions in naval history. The Indianapolis had carried the future across the Pacific and delivered it exactly where it needed to be, exactly when it needed to be there. As the Indianapolis prepared to leave Tinian for her next assignment, Captain McVay and his crew were justifiably proud of what they had accomplished. They had completed their mission with speed, precision, and absolute reliability. They had no way of knowing that this success had just signed their death warrant. In 3 days, Little Boy would be loaded aboard the Enola Gay. In less than 2 weeks, Hiroshima would cease to exist. And in 4 days, the Indianapolis herself would be resting on the bottom of the Pacific, taking 879 of her crew with her. The most successful mission of her career had just become her last. So there you have it, the story of the USS Indianapolis, a ship that did everything her country asked of her, right up until the moment her country forgot she existed. She fought in the frozen hell of the Aleutians and the tropical inferno of the Central Pacific. She served as flagship for some of the most important victories in American naval history. She carried the atomic bomb components that ended World War II, completing what was arguably the most crucial cargo run in human history. And then she got torpedoed while nobody was looking. The Indianapolis spent 4 years proving she was one of the finest ships in the Pacific Fleet. It took 4 days floating in shark-infested waters to show what her crew was made of. And it took one court-martial to demonstrate that sometimes, when things go catastrophically wrong, the people in charge would rather blame a dead man than admit they screwed up. Captain McVay's court-martial was a masterpiece of institutional ass-covering. Here was a man who had successfully commanded his ship through some of the worst fighting of the Pacific War, who had delivered the weapon that ended the conflict, and who had survived 4 days in the ocean watching his crew die around him. His reward was to be dragged in front of a court-martial and blamed for the deaths of 879 sailors. The Navy's argument was essentially this: yes, we forgot to tell anyone the ship was coming. Yes, we ignored the SOS signals. Yes, we didn't notice the ship was missing for 4 days. But it's the captain's fault because he sailed in a straight line instead of zigzagging. It was like blaming a mugging victim for not running fast enough. The real tragedy isn't just that 879 good men died in the water. The real tragedy is that they died because a system that was supposed to protect them failed at every level, and then that same system spent decades trying to avoid responsibility for that failure. Captain McVay was found guilty of hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag, a charge that would have been laughable if it wasn't so tragic. Even Mochizaru Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who torpedoed the Indianapolis, testified that zigzagging wouldn't have made any difference. But logic and justice were apparently optional at this particular court-martial. McVay was given a reprimand, essentially a slap on the wrist, but the damage was done. For the rest of his life, he received hate mail from families who blamed him for their sons' deaths. In 1968, unable to bear the burden any longer, he took his own life. It wasn't until 2055 years too late that Congress officially exonerated Captain McVay. A young Florida student named Hunter Scott had researched the Indianapolis story for a history project and discovered what everyone should have known all along. McVay was a scapegoat, not a criminal. The Navy, with all the grace of a bureaucracy caught with its pants down, quietly amended McVay's record. No apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a bureaucratic correction that came decades after it could do any good for the man they'd destroyed. But here's what the Navy couldn't take away: the Indianapolis and her crew had completed their mission. Every single one of them, the living and the dead, the survivors and the victims, had done their duty to the end. The uranium they carried to Tinian became Little Boy, the atomic bomb that helped end World War II. The sacrifice of the Indianapolis crew contributed to a victory that saved countless American lives by making an invasion of Japan unnecessary. Today, the Indianapolis rests 12,000 feet down in the Pacific, discovered only in 2017 by a team led by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen. The ship lies broken but intact, a steel monument to the men who served aboard her. The survivors are almost all gone now. Of the 316 men who were pulled from the water, fewer than a dozen were still alive as of this writing. But their story lives on, told and retold by historians, filmmakers, and occasionally by know-it-all documentary narrators who think they're funnier than they actually are. The story of the Indianapolis is more than just another World War II disaster. It's a reminder that victory comes at a price, that institutions are only as good as the people running them, and that sometimes the biggest enemy isn't the guy shooting at you, it's the guy behind you who's supposed to be watching your back. The crew of the USS Indianapolis deserves to be remembered not as victims, but as sailors who did their duty under impossible circumstances. They delivered the weapon that ended the war, they fought to survive when their ship was taken from under them, and they endured an injustice that lasted for decades. They were, in the end, exactly what their country asked them to be: ordinary men who did extraordinary things when their nation needed them most. The fact that their nation then failed them doesn't diminish what they accomplished. It just makes their sacrifice all the more profound. The Indianapolis is gone. Her crew is gone. But their story remains, a testament to duty, courage, and the price of victory in a world that too often forgets both the cost of war and the value of the men who fight it. Remember them not as casualties of bureaucratic incompetence, but as the heroes they always were. I hope you found this video valuable. If it was helpful, Please like and share it with someone who could benefit. Subscribe for more content like this, and if you want to support the channel while getting exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member. Your support means everything to me. Until next time, take care.